Good evening. My name is Cynthia Body Willis. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, Maryland's program, Responsible and Effective Policing. Can civilian oversight make a difference? A renewed public interest in reimagining the relationship between police and the communities they have sworn to protect led to game-changing legislation in the Maryland General Assembly. Now, county officials are working to put these laws into action. Tonight's webinar will give attendees a sense of what steps are being taken, how law enforcement in Montgomery County may or may not need to adjust, and what data show about civilian oversight's role in this process. A Q&A will follow the presentations, but first some housekeeping details. This webinar is being presented by the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County. The meeting is being recorded and is being streamed live to Facebook. The recording will be made available at a later date on our YouTube channel. We're going to put some links in the chat box that you may find useful. The audience will be muted during the webinar, and the chat box has been disabled for attendees to minimize distractions. After our speakers make their presentations, we will have a Q&A session. The questions will be visible as they are answered. We encourage you to ask questions, but want to remind everyone to be respectful of our speakers and each other. To submit a question, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the box, then hit send or return. We will answer as many questions as time allows. The program is scheduled to end at 8:30 p.m. Now, I am pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Gabe Albanos is an at-large member and president of the Montgomery County Council, having been elected to office in November 2018. He chairs the Health and Human Services Committee and serves on the Public Safety Committee. In these roles, he oversees public health and human services that impact children, adults, and seniors in the county, as well as current policies to maintain transparency and increase the accountability of public safety departments. Will Jawando is also an at-large member of the Montgomery County Council, elected to office in November 2018. He serves on the Education and Culture Committee, for which he is the lead member for libraries, and on the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. In these roles, he oversees issues related to Montgomery County Public Schools, economic development, parks and recreation, and others. Marcus Jones has served in the Montgomery County Police Department since 1985 and became chief in 2019. Throughout his tenure on the force, he has been a captain, a drug enforcement commander, and an assistant chief who supervised all investigation divisions. He is also a former chairman of the National Black Police Association. And finally, Florence Finkel serves on the board of directors for the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement and chairs its Training, Education, and Standards Committee. She prosecuted corrupt officers while at the New York County District Attorney's Office, and she was the Deputy Executive Director for Investigations and Executive Director of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. Most recently, she worked as a consultant with the Seattle Police Monitor and the District of Columbia Police Reform Commission. It is my pleasure to invite Florence Finkel to begin tonight's program. Florence?
Thank you for that introduction. I'm here to represent the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement and appreciate the invitation from the League of Women Voters. Known by its acronym NACOL, NACOL is the nation's only organization of police and corrections oversight agencies, practitioners, and supporters. Established in 1995, NACOL's mission is to support independent oversight agencies that make law enforcement departments transparent, accountable, and responsible to communities they serve. My presentation this evening will focus on some of the basics. What is civilian oversight? What models of civilian oversight exist? NACOL's 13 principles for effective oversight, and realistic expectations for what civilian oversight on its own can achieve. Civilian oversight of law enforcement is based on the concept of accountability. It's rooted in the principle that in a democratic society, law enforcement must answer to the public. It grew out of the belief that the police can't police themselves, an adage that isn't new. Civilian oversight of law enforcement is external to the law enforcement agency, independent of the law enforcement agency, and consists of ongoing review of the law enforcement agency's sworn officers' actions and/or its policies and practices. And one thing to keep in mind is that accountability operates on two levels. One is holding individual officers accountable, and the second is holding the law enforcement agency accountable. And the two are connected. So in the case of a shooting, for example, you have to examine both the officer's actions as well as the agency's training, tactical procedures, supervision, and policies that might have contributed to the incident. Civilian oversight of law enforcement can be designed to address both these facets of accountability. The narrowness or expansiveness of civilian oversight's goals is related to the narrowness or expansiveness of the civilian oversight entities that a community establishes. In general, the objectives of civilian oversight of law enforcement include ensuring that the complaint process is accessible to everyone, ensuring that investigations are thorough and fair and its outcomes reasonable and discipline appropriate, deterring misconduct, reducing legal liability for taxpayers, enhancing transparency of law enforcement through public reporting. And just a word here about transparency. Transparency is key to accountability. It's often said that sunshine is the best disinfectant. And if police policies and procedures, data, investigative and disciplinary processes and outcomes, and other records are secret, it's impossible for the public to hold the police to account. Through transparency, civilian oversight of law enforcement can also enhance public understanding of the investigative and disciplinary processes and law enforcement policy, training, and practices. It can improve those policies, the training, supervision, and practices through an analysis of misconduct investigations and other data. And ultimately, the goal of civilian oversight is to increase public confidence and trust in law enforcement, because without that, law enforcement can't be effective. Historically, civilian oversight agencies initially focused on what we would call back-end accountability, reacting to incidents after the fact and focusing on investigations and discipline. Over time, the concept of civilian oversight has evolved, particularly in the last couple of decades, to be more proactive, front-end accountability, we would call it, focusing on data collection through audits, investigations, and examination of best practices to identify issues to improve law enforcement. There are approximately 200 civilian oversight agencies that exist in the US, and no two are exactly alike. Each type of oversight entity has its strengths and weaknesses. There's the review-focused model, which is what Maryland is creating, the investigation-focused model, the auditor, monitor, inspector general, commissions, which help manage the police agency, and hybrid systems and agencies. NACOL's view is that creating effective civilian oversight agencies that are responsive to the community takes time, planning, and collaborative and transparent discussions among stakeholders. You need buy-in from the outset and as time progresses in order to have effective civilian oversight. I'm going to examine a little bit what each of these models consist of. The review focus model involves civilians being able to assess and provide input into the internal investigative process. The idea being that public review of investigations can generate trust in the investigative process. And although the range of authority amongst different types of agencies that fall within this model varies, this model typically has the authority to receive public complaints and forward them to the law enforcement agency. It can review completed investigations and provide feedback to the law enforcement agency, recommend case dispositions or discipline, hear appeals, in some cases from members of the public or subject officers, hold public forums and public meetings, and conduct community outreach. Examples, Knoxville, Tennessee, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Fairfax County, Virginia, have all created this type of model. This model is relatively, compared to some of the other models, relatively inexpensive. The investigation-focused model, in this model, civilians are the ones conducting investigations independently from the law enforcement agency. They're the ones conducting interviews of department personnel and members of the public, and they are responsible for obtaining all the relevant documentary evidence. They prepare reports and recommend or make allegation dispositions. In some cases, they can recommend discipline. They typically hold public forums and public meetings and conduct community outreach. The idea here is that when civilians conduct the investigations, it can reduce the bias of in misconduct investigations, increase public trust in the investigative process. I should also say that this model, these agencies typically also operate mediation programs. New York, Chicago, the District of Columbia, and San Francisco have all created independent civilian investigative agencies. These agencies are expensive and resource intensive. The auditor, monitor, or IG focus model, which involves civilians conducting audits and monitoring and assessing a range of department policies and practices, is the most common form of external police oversight in the country. The range of authority can, like in other models, vary. Typically, the auditor or IG ensure that the complaint, investigative, and disciplinary process complies with policies and best practices. They make recommendations to improve those policies and practices and others in areas other than those relating to misconduct allegations. They publish frequent reports and they conduct community outreach. Seattle, Denver, New York, New Orleans, and Los Angeles are all cities that have created this type of civilian oversight. The idea here is that this model promotes long-term systemic change. It's less expensive generally than the investigation-focused model, but more expensive than the review-focused model. There are also police commissions where members of the public help manage the law enforcement agency. These are designed to give the public a greater voice in how it's policed. And commissions possess the power to do more than just make recommendations. In Los Angeles, for example, the Board of Police Commissioners serves as the board of directors for the LAPD, and the chief reports to the Board of Police Commissioners. Commissions develop and finalize police department policies. The police department can't finalize a substantive policy without the commission's approval. They may play a role in hiring, evaluating, and firing the chief, approving the police department budget, in some cases adjudicating allegations of misconduct or determining discipline, and they conduct public meetings. Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, and Detroit are examples of cities that have created commissions. And finally, we have kind of hybrid models and systems. So for example, a lot of investigation-focused and review-focused agencies possess the authority to make issue-based policy recommendations stemming from the information and data in the investigations they review or conduct. And some cities have established multiple oversight agencies that perform different functions. New York is one of those cities, and Chicago is another. In Chicago, they just created a Chicago Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability. And in addition to the responsibilities that a commission usually has, this commission also oversees what's known as COPA, the Office of Police Accountability, which is an independent civilian investigative body, and it oversees the Chicago Police Board, which is a civilian administrative tribunal that handles disciplinary cases. And independent of those entities is the Chicago Office of the Inspector General Public Safety Section. Across all model types, reviewing completed internal affairs investigations is the most common oversight function. Unfortunately, so far, no one has figured out how to empirically measure whether oversight works or what models are best. In NACOL's view, what's best is what works best for the particular community. And given the political landscape, budget, size of the department, stakeholder priorities, and community expectations. Based on academic literature and practitioners' experiences, NACOL has identified what we believe to be the most important foundational preconditions for effective oversight, what we call effective practices approach. And one word of caution, these principles exist on a continuum, they're overlapping, and adherence to them is often a matter of degree, depending on what's possible, feasible, and congruent with community expectations. I'm going to try to get through all 13 quickly. Independence. Principle number 1, structural, political, and operational independence. At its core, it's an absence of real or perceived influence from law enforcement, political actors, and special interests looking to affect the civilian oversight agency's operations. And it could do this through appointment or the removal process, reporting lines, budgeting, and even who serves as the agency's counsel. Principle 2, clearly defined and adequate jurisdiction and authority. You need adequate and clear jurisdiction and authority to meet the expectation and goals that the community has for the agency. In a review-focused model, for example, you have to have the ability to address deficiencies and promote corrective action through mechanisms that make law enforcement executives accountable to the concerns and issues you raise. So, for example, chiefs should be compelled, often in enabling legislation, to respond to the review agency's identified deficiencies and concerns. Principle 3, unfettered access to records and facilities. For a review model, you need unedited investigative files, including disciplinary records, if you possess the power to recommend or impose discipline. Principle 4, access to law enforcement executives and internal affairs staff. Of course, ongoing dialogue and mutual responsiveness are critical. But again, if you have the power to make recommendations, the enabling legislation in NACOL's view should require that the law enforcement agency provide a timely response within a specified timeframe that's written and public, detailing why it's accepting or rejecting, in whole or in part, the oversight agency's recommendations. Principle 5. This is effective oversight requires cooperation of all the law enforcement agencies, officers, and staff in the course of their work. NACOL's belief is that it should be a condition of employment. It's most relevant to investigation-focused agencies. Principle 6, sustained stakeholder support. Ongoing engagement and support from stakeholders is an important component of effectiveness. If you don't provide the entity with resources, if you don't fill unoccupied seats, if you don't permit the entity to hire, if there's consistent disregard for its findings and recommendations, or there's an unwillingness to address outstanding issues, the citizen oversight entity is going to be undermined. Principle 7, you need adequate funding and resources in the form of budgets, staffing, training, and technology, and that support has to be sustained and ongoing. Some jurisdictions have linked the civilian oversight entity's budget to a percentage of the police department budget or the jurisdiction's general budget, or it's linked staffing of the civilian oversight entity to police department personnel numbers. Principle 8, public reporting and transparency. I already discussed how important transparency is to accountability. Public reports that the civilian oversight entity issues shouldn't be subject to censorship or modification by law enforcement or political stakeholders. They should be easily accessible and include as much information as permitted by law. Principle 9, performing analysis of policy and patterns in practice. This is not that relevant to review-focused agencies, but so I'm going to move on to Principle 10, community outreach. Civilian oversight is an entity representing the interests of the community as a whole. Outreach to the community and stakeholders is important to effectiveness. And a lot of agencies have staff dedicated to community outreach. It builds awareness of the existence of the agency and builds and maintains relationships with stakeholders. Principle 11, community involvement. This is particularly important when a community like yours is creating civilian oversight or strengthening existing civilian oversight. You need to have the community and stakeholders on board to get buy-in. And once you are establishing a civilian oversight agency, the community involvement, for example, board members, should represent the local population's composition and diversity. Principle 12, confidentiality, anonymity, and protection from retaliation. Oversight practitioners have to possess the same integrity, professionalism, and ethical standards we expect from law enforcement. You can't leak confidential information. You have to maintain anonymity to the extent permitted. And the jurisdiction should have procedures that guard against retaliation. Principle 13, procedural justice and legitimacy should serve as core principles guiding the work of civilian oversight. Academic research shows that individuals' belief, whether it's members of the public or officers, in the legitimacy of a process or an organization hinges on how people are treated, which is actually more important than the outcome. So you have to build into the civilian oversight process concepts of dignity, politeness, respect, treating people fairly and impartially, giving individuals the opportunity to be heard, and providing explanations for decisions. Finally, this forum is asking the question, can civilian oversight make a difference? Even if there's no empirical evidence to prove it, I would argue that giving civilians voice into the internal investigation process or allowing them to conduct misconduct investigations makes a difference. One, the public voice is important on its own. Based upon my own experience, I know that civilians can often reach different results than the law enforcement agency. Yes, it matters if civilians are conducting audits, monitoring various practices, and issuing reports and recommendations, revealing how the department works. These recommendations have across the country led to changes in police department policy, training, hiring, and practices. Transparency on its own is key. And aside from the public voice, civilian oversight entities, their public reporting function is important. Their public meetings are important. They make law enforcement transparent, which can create press coverage and public pressure and lead to improvements in reform if they weren't already forthcoming. But even if all 13 principles of effective oversight are met, and often they aren't, I think it should be understood that civilian oversight is not a panacea. It's just one tool in the toolbox to address police misconduct and other issues. And community expectations should comport with the scope of the civilian oversight endeavor. So if you're creating a review agency that has jurisdiction to review public complaints of misconduct, and the community also has issues with how the police department is conducting sex crime investigations, it's be unrealistic to expect the civilian oversight entity with that jurisdiction to be able to address certain other communities' concerns, like sex crimes investigations. And I want to say one other thing about tenure matters. So today at the table, the community representatives and stakeholders, whether it's political actors or law enforcement agency heads or even union officials, might be all in to transparency, accountability, and reform. But 2, 3, 4 years down the line, we might have different actors in those seats, and they might not be so committed. So tenure matters, and it's important that there's an ongoing commitment from leaders to law enforcement accountability. Otherwise, it can have a detrimental impact on the civilian oversight entity. Anyway, thank you for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Finkel, for your presentation. I now invite Councilmember Albanos to present.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. What an honor and privilege to be with all of you this evening and with the League of Women Voters. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you all as an organization, and we're going to need your help again this summer as we move the primary to July, and it's going to be critically important that we educate our public so that we can have a robust voter turnout. And it's an honor to be on tonight's panel with Ms. Finkel. That was an incredibly impressive presentation, as well as my colleague and friend, Councilmember Jawando and Chief Jones. So as Cynthia mentioned, my name is Gabe Albornoz. I serve as president of the County Council this year, and I'm proud to serve with colleagues who have aggressively been pursuing and ensuring that the county raised the stakes with regards to transparency and accountability. While I do believe we have a very strong law enforcement division here in Montgomery County, and Chief Jones is representative of that long history of leaders that we've had come through the Montgomery County Police Department, we've acknowledged that not everyone has shared the same experiences, and not everyone feels that they have been treated fairly or equitably over generations. And there's a historical construct that I have learned a lot more about these last 2 years that is really important to take notice of and to be reflective of, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and really move forward. And I do want to give my colleague and friend, Councilmember Jawando, a lot of credit. He's been out in front on many of these issues, and I've learned a great deal from him, as well as all of my colleagues, but also law enforcement itself. I've had the opportunity to participate in some ride-alongs late last year, and really opened my eyes to what law enforcement is facing currently on the ground, and the unique sets of challenges that are here before us as we come out of the pandemic and try to balance ensuring accountability and transparency while also addressing the complex needs of a job that is difficult on a good day. And there is a sobering reality that 63% of our officers in Montgomery County are eligible for retirement right now as we speak. And this most recent cadet class was one of the smallest we've had in the history of Montgomery County. So we want to make sure we enhance and sustain and increase that accountability, while also ensuring that we provide support to the officers who I believe by and large do the right thing, take these jobs for the right reasons, and work holistically with the community in a way that's sustainable. And if there's enough time, I'll share a personal story before I turn it over to the next speaker. But I do want to spend the bulk of my time discussing an issue that's before the council right now, and that is Bill 4921. This is a piece of legislation to enact at the local level legislation that was passed in the General Assembly in Annapolis that requires every jurisdiction to establish a formal police accountability board, and subsequently an administrative charging committee that I will refer to it as the PAB will be responsible for appointing. What this body will do is effectively take what is currently the chiefs of police's responsibility across the state with regards to disciplinary matters, and will transfer that disciplinary process over to the Police Accountability Board directly. There are 2 subsequent processes that law enforcement will be able to go through if they don't feel they had been treated fairly through the civilian process. But this process, we know, is critically important to ensuring, as Ms. Finkel noted, in ensuring trust of our community, of law enforcement. And the General Assembly, this is a little complicated, so bear with me. But as we speak, the General Assembly is looking at making some amendments to the bill that they passed at the state level. And so in real time, as jurisdictions are working to pass our own local legislation, we may be subject to some changes that are occurring at the state level. The County Council introduced this legislation in December at the request of the county executive. And there was some leeway or a longer runway that the state offered each local jurisdiction, as Ms. Finkel noted, to create a system that we feel works best for us. And there have been numerous amendments that have been made throughout this process, many of which have been recommended by local community advocates that have really done an excellent job in educating this council on best practices that Ms. Finkel mentioned in her presentation on ensuring that we have an effective and transparent and efficient community advisory board that can help ensure that everyone is heard throughout these very important processes. So just to highlight some of the adjustments we've made in the amendments that we've passed forward in a bill that we will be voting on soon, we increased the initial recommended number of police advisory board members from 5 to 9. And this police advisory board will have the responsibility of overseeing not just our Montgomery County Police Department and the complaints raised by civilians, but also our municipal police departments as well, which include Gaithersburg, Tacoma Park, Rockville, and the town of Chevy Chase. And so there's a requirement that there be at least one of the 9 members be a resident from one of those municipalities. We have also given the county executive the freedom, the ability to appoint an alternate member of the police advisory board who can provide some additional support and also step in the event and ensure a seamless transition if one of the members is unable to choose. And this body is critically important and will then appoint the Administrative Charging Committee, who will be the formal committee that hears cases. And as again, I'm going to keep referring back to Ms. Finkel because there are a lot of her recommendations that we tried to enact in this legislation. But one of those is we are including in the legislation the requirement that there be full-time staff associated with this work, so that this is not work on top of people's existing portfolios that can be lost in the shuffle, particularly during challenging times here in our community, so that they have the support that they need to be effective. We've also recommended that members of the Administrative Charging Committee be paid $16,000, and the chair of the Police Advisory Board, who will also serve on the Administrative Charging Committee, will be paid as well. We have not confirmed, but we know that the majority of my colleagues support that members of the Police Advisory Board be compensated as well. That number is yet to be determined because we are still working through what exactly the job description will be of both entities, so that we can ensure that we pay in a way that is consistent with other payments of other boards and commissions. This would be one of the few that actually is paid. But we understand the importance of this issue, and that we have to ensure that there be a higher degree of accountability, and that this is more than just the work of, while I have a great deal of respect for our volunteers, we want to make sure that this stature of this particular advisory body rises to a higher level. Some of the other highlights that I'll mention that we have worked through as well is the council has also acknowledged that we support that an independent legal advisor be assigned to this particular police advisory board as well. How exactly that will work is still something that we are working through. But while I have a great deal of respect for our county attorney's office, there is a concern that the county attorney's office obviously advises both the council and the current police department. And while I believe in their independence, we have to make sure that the public agrees and really respects that independence, and that perception is in fact reality. So that will add to the funding mechanism and the budget that we will work through as well. The three really great pieces of information here that I think are important for our public to know as we continue the deliberation over this important bill are the following. The legislative branch and the executive branch have worked closely together on this, and there is great alliance between the county executive and the council. There's also been really significant agreement among my colleagues on the council. This, at some points, has been an important and complex issue to tackle generally. But this, among many other instances, we have seen great cooperation and great coordination among all of my colleagues, ensuring that we enact this legislation. And lastly, I want to mention that we've had great cooperation from our police department. We have had very responsive responses to our questions. Police Chief Jones and Assistant Chiefs have testified all the way through, as well as the chiefs of police of our respective municipalities. And I think all of that collectively working together has produced as close to a product that I think meets where all of these issues intersect as I think you're going to find. Other jurisdictions across the state I have read have complained about the transparency of that process. We were intentional in the work groups to widen the number of people that testified, including representatives from well-respected organizations that are passionately advocating for police reform. And we also, I need to mention, are on a tight time crunch with the enactment of this bill, because as it currently stands, it has to be enacted by July 1st, which means that these members need to be recruited, they need to be interviewed, and there's a requirement in the legislation that they be formally trained. And all of that has to happen at the moment by July 1st. And so the council has aggressively been moving forward to be able to enact this bill as reasonably as possible on the calendar to give the executive branch a long enough runway to be able to execute this very important plan. So I'm confident in the process that we have followed thus far. To be candid, we got off to a bumpy start because in December there was understandable concern that members of the public had not had an opportunity to weigh in on the initial draft of the legislation. But as I stated earlier, it has been significantly amended since then. And it's important we get this right, because in addition to the trust of our community and our civilians and our constituents, this does also have to have the trust of law enforcement too, because as I mentioned, the disciplinary process has now been shifted to this body. So I'll end with this very quick story, because we all come at these issues from different angles and perspectives, different life experiences, different professional experiences. I've lived in Montgomery County my whole life, and my first interaction with Montgomery County Police occurred when I was about 12 years old. And my parents sold their house in Gaithersburg, and my parents sold their house in Silver Spring, and we moved to Bethesda. And within a few years, we befriended our neighbor, who was an elderly widowed woman who was lovely. And from time to time, I would help her bring her groceries into her house. I would help mow her lawn. And one night while we were home, she was senselessly murdered in what appears to have been a botched robbery. And as it turns out, I was likely one of the last people to ever speak to her while she was alive. The Montgomery County detective that came to interview me and my family to try and glean information was one of the kindest and most patient and just really understood the magnitude and scope of the fear in my eyes and what had just transpired. And the humanity that that officer showed me during an incredibly emotional period in my life that really shaped me in a lot of different ways is something we expect of all officers. But that humanity has to cut many different ways. And we have to acknowledge again that these are incredibly difficult positions. And Montgomery County Police, as you'll hear soon from Chief Jones, has tried to stay ahead of the curve and establish a police department that we all can be proud of, and that really ensures that we are serving all of our residents with dignity and respect. So I look forward to answering questions, but thank you so much, Cynthia. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Council Member. And I will now invite Council Member Jawando to present.
Thank you, Cynthia, and to the entire group, League of Women Voters. You do such great work and have done so for a long time. So just want to thank you all for having us tonight. It's great to be with Ms. Finkel. Appreciated her presentation greatly and the work that the organization has done as a group, but also your work individually. Thanks for being here tonight. And also Council President Alvarez, that's my colleague. It's good to be here with him as well. And with Chief Jones, good to see you too as well, sir. Thank you, everybody. I want to start with just some context. The police departments in this country, in the history of policing, is really important to understand when you talk about why, the why. You know, we're having a discussion tonight about some very specific things. Is civilian oversight effective? Why is it important? And you have to ask, well, what has led us to the moment where we're having a discussion and have been for the last several years and for a long time, really, but intensely for the last several years, about reimagining public safety and particularly changing the way policing happens. And you do that because if you look at the history of policing, some of the first police forces or the predecessors of police forces were what are called slave patrols in the Carolinas. And you go to the African American History Museum, you can see a form of those badges in the museum. And I'll just read to you, I think it's important context. This is the oath from the North Carolina Slave Patrol. I, patroller's name, do swear that I will, as searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully and as privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs, to the best of my power, so help me God. And that's from the Carolina Slave Patrol. Sounds very similar to an oath that many public officials take today. And you can see the direct link to a brutal system of chattel slavery that developed and law enforcement used as a tool to keep that system in place. You fast forward to the Jim Crow laws of the South, the whole country used to enforce, again, a brutal regime of discrimination. You can expand that to the LGBTQ community and immigrant communities. And you see why over time, over centuries, there's been generational trauma and lack of trust and disproportionate policing for certain communities, right? Particularly Black and Brown and Indigenous and disabled communities and LGBTQ communities. You have to understand that before you have this conversation, because that's the why of why this all is necessary. And I think another thing that's really important is to realize that this is not necessarily a new conversation. We've had, and I'm going to try to share my screen here and see if it works. All right, here we go. We're cooking with gas. So I just wanted to provide some of that framing, and I'll see if I can go forward here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so a little bit about police reform in Montgomery County. So I've talked a little bit about the why it's necessary, and I'll get into that. I'll come back to that point. But we're talking about these types of bills, and I really appreciated Ms. Finkel talking about this is a part of a comprehensive strategy, right? This is not a silver bullet. There are, pun intended, there are no panacea options here. You have a system that's developed over hundreds of years. There's a lot of factors involved in it, some out of the control of law enforcement, many of them out of the control of law enforcement, how we've developed. And so you have to do many things at the same time. And this is something that I just think is helpful when you're thinking about it. I have kind of three main principles. They're bunched into two here, but you have to have the right people in law enforcement. And Councilmember Alvarez shared a very touching story about someone he had an encounter with as a child. that had left a great impression upon him. You have to have the right people with the right training, with the right mission. So people who have communication skills, who understand the communities in which they're serving, who understand that the power is delegated to them by the people. I think that was another very important point by Ms. Finkel. We delegate to our police and to our government to perform certain functions, among them public safety. And it's the people who elect me and Councilman Robin Oz and who pay our tax dollars who can decide how that power is exercised. And so whether it be setting the rules of the road or being involved in police discipline, it's an extension of that delegated authority. People who understand the community, people who are paid well and who are professional and have the right mindset, the guardian versus the warrior mindset. Some of you may have heard, it's been a lot been written. And that was a concept that came out of the 21st Century Policing Task Force of President Obama, which I was a part of. The right mission, focused on the things that most people think police should be focused on: violent crime, doing the job of investigating and holding accountable people who are the perpetrators of violent crime and deterring that crime by doing so. And I think over time, you've seen mission creep, and we've asked our police, just like we've asked a lot of agencies, to do more than is in their scope, dealing with people who are experiencing homelessness, dealing with people who have mental health challenges, and the like. And that has created some unintended and devastating consequences as well. So you need the right people with the right scope and mission, and you also need this accountability and transparency throughout the process. Part of that, an example of that accountability and transparency, is a police accountability board in the bill that we're taking up right now. And when you have those things, you're going to have improved community trust, improved resident safety, improved officer safety. And it also addresses this, that we're against each other. It's when you have more of an equal playing field and that there's accountability and transparency and the right people in these positions, that addresses all of these issues that we have and will improve police outcomes. And this is something I think also is important. Why have we taken up this work in Montgomery County? I think it's very easy. I've been here my entire life. I grew up very low income in a section of Montgomery County where I heard gunshots just about every night. Quebec Terrace, Langley Park area of Montgomery County. And I knew what it meant to want to feel safe and not always feeling safe. I lost several friends to gun violence. My best friend when I was a teenager in a drug deal gone bad. So I know in a deeply personal way, in a local context way, why it's so important to have safe communities. I worked at the police department as an AmeriCorps member when I graduated high school before I went to college for a year to earn money for college, and had a police ID and earned a paycheck from the county and played McGruff the crime dog in schools and logged evidence and went on many ride-alongs and a whole bunch of other functions. I worked as an honors intern at the FBI while I was in college because I thought I might want to pursue a career in law enforcement. At one point, I ended up going a different route and going to law school and becoming a civil rights lawyer and doing a whole bunch of things, and now serving as a council member. But I say all that to say, I understand the need for law enforcement. But if you look at this list, this has all happened since I was elected. We had the officer involved in Montgomery County, the officer involved killing of Robert White, who was shot 7 times. He was walking in his neighborhood, had a ripped jacket, was perceived to be a threat. An encounter pursued, he charged the officer and was killed. We had the detainment of 3 African-American young men who were stopped and frisked, 2 of whom cried in my office relaying this experience. They were called the N-word by an officer in May 2019 in front of a McDonald's in White Oak. Weren't charged with the crime, but had to deal with a very demeaning and dehumanizing experience that was caught on tape and made national news. There was a less publicized case of a Wheaton student. The very highly publicized case of an officer less publicized, of Wheaton students who were walking down a road and were detained for jaywalking, and also met with these students. We had an officer from the Wheaton District, Officer Morris, convicted of assault by a jury, second-degree assault for kneeing a year before George Floyd, about 9 months before George Floyd was killed, for a knee in his neck and head back area. We had this officer knee a young man who was handcuffed in front of an Aspen Hill McDonald's and was charged with assault and convicted by a jury. That sentence was later thrown out by the judge as far as the sentencing. You talk about the need for trust for there to be actual consequences. We had Fanon Burhay, who was dealing with a mental health crisis and was wielding a knife in White Oak and was shot and killed by an officer. We had a no-knock warrant for a fire department member, Mr. Palma, and his family, who were not the targets, but were guns shoved in their face, they're dehumanized, and are suing the county right now. We had the 5-year-old Black boy who was wandered off from school and was yelled at and called a beast and detained and handcuffed. That made international news in January of 2020. And we didn't find out about it until a year later because the family sued. So when you talk about having accountability and transparency, it's really even hard for us as council members sometimes to do so. We had Ryan LaRue killed in July of 2021 by Gaithersburg police. I give you some examples because I think often there's this narrative that nothing has happened here. And while I agree we have a great department, we do have issues, and there's systemic issues that are the same issues that are facing people across the country. When you look at our statistics, half of the people we arrest in this county are Black. Black residents make up 20% of the population. You're 9 times more likely to be pulled over in Bethesda as a Black resident as a white resident, despite that Bethesda is almost 90% white. You go down the list, we have serious disparities in who's a juvenile arrest, which is over 50% Black. And we have issues that we need to get to the bottom of and to improve. Next slide, and then I'll wrap up here. What have we done? We've done a lot, and we've done a lot together. Councilman Robert has mentioned, I appreciate him mentioning it. When I introduced Bill 119, which was on Martin Luther King's birthday, we get sworn in December 4th, 2018. On January 15th, 2019, the first bill introduced by this council was the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act that I introduced that passed unanimously, which required independent investigations and reporting, in public reporting, anytime an officer killed a resident. This is on the heels of Robert White's death. The principles of that bill are now enshrined in the legislation that was passed in Annapolis, where there's now an independent process statewide where the Attorney General investigates all police-involved deaths, which is something I also had advocated for. And we, almost 2 years before the state acted, we acted here locally. We established a police advisory commission, a bill I worked on with Councilmember Reamer. We put in a landmark use of force policy, which we're now being sued we were sued by the police union because of this policy. We won in court, and I understand that they may appeal, but that said that you couldn't use knees in the neck. You can't, officers are protected if they comment or if they intervene when an officer is committing misconduct, and it raised the standard of when deadly force can be used to when it's only absolutely necessary. And there's a long list here I won't go through because I'm probably running out of time, but I want to talk about 1721, the Community Informed Police Training Act, which is pending, and I'm hopeful will pass soon, that will help take advantage and address that issue of recruitment and how we bring in the right people with the right training. It'll add 6 weeks or 30 hours, the weeks could depend, 30 hours of a learning course on the history of policing, racial equity and social justice, communication skills, de-escalation. In Montgomery College, we announced that at Montgomery College is going to be delivering that curriculum as part of the training academy. Very excited about that. I think they have 700 students studying criminal justice, the vast majority who are students of color, the vast majority who are from Montgomery County, who understand the community. That can create a natural pipeline of people in law enforcement to make sure they better understand our community. Councilman Rabanaz talked about the accountability board, the settlement agreement. We have no knowledge. I introduced a bill that we passed of when there's a lawsuit and there's a settlement, we have to have reporting on a yearly basis, but also in a public, transparent way about what is being settled across county government, not just police. There's very little transparency about that. It's very hard to find and understand it. That's something that's also important as we move forward. So the last slide I'll have here, I'm just going to go through these in about 30 seconds. You saw the bill 4921 that Councilmember Rabanaz mentioned. This is a bill we're working our way through now. The PAB, the Police Accountability Board, and the Administrative Charging Committee will review all complaints filed by members of the public about police misconduct. Again, that's important for public trust and transparency. Councilmember Rabanaz talked about the outlines of it. This is just a little bit about it here. Once they render their decision, the police chief has to abide by that or go higher. There's still due process for the police officer. And if they disagree, they can appeal to a trial board. It's important to note that this will not go into effect for rank and file officers until the next collective bargaining agreement in July of 2023. It'll go into effect after we hear what's happening in Annapolis later this year for other officers higher than that, the lieutenants and above. And so this is going to be an ongoing process, and we're going to have to keep working on it. And that's where I'll end, because I think the point was made by Ms. Finke, and I couldn't agree more. We have to do all these things at the same time, and it's hard, and it's new, and it's different. And it's not saying that people are bad or good. It's that the system we have is not working. It hasn't worked for a long time for many people. And that doesn't mean every individual actor, we don't have people who are trying to do a great job. They absolutely are. But we have to make a change. The public has demanded it. And that's our job, to try to guide that change. And so I appreciate you all having me tonight and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Council Member. And finally, I will ask Chief Jones to present.
Good evening, and thank you, Cynthia. And in the midst of time being short and my time being a little bit cut into, I will try to get through as quickly as possible. But good evening to everyone. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County for inviting me to have this discussion, along with Council President Albornoz and Council Member Jawando, as well as Ms. Finkel. And very nice to hear her presentation as well about law enforcement. You know, there are 18,000 police departments in the United States of America. And one thing that I think Ms. Finkel hit upon in a large scale, policing is local. And our communities must understand what do they desire law enforcement to look like in their particular communities. And I have been on this department for 36 years. Montgomery County Police is one of the most well-respected police departments in this nation. There are lots of phenomenal leaders who have come from this department who are now leading other police agencies across the country. In fact, our former Chief Manger is now the Chief of U.S. Capitol Police. And we've got others who lead in Charleston, South Carolina, and other agencies all across this country. And that means something that we come from a proud agency. And with that being said, we have heard the General Assembly speak in regards to this legislation. And it is, something that we've seen around police reform that's been discussed not only here in Montgomery County, but across the entire country for a variety of reasons. Myself as a chief and have been a police professional in this profession for the 36 years, I can tell you that, in any profession, change is always warranted. Law enforcement has changed tremendously since I began here in 1985. But the one thing I would stress that I will say wholeheartedly as an overall organization, we have truly been committed to the people here in Montgomery County. And as Mr. Jawando has noted, many of the negative instances that have occurred, the interactions with bad outcomes in some cases, I will tell you that in the majority, in many cases that are not highlighted in the media, our police officers do a phenomenal job of interacting with the community. And that is based upon their training that they have received. And we see many excellent examples of those particular incidents on a daily basis. But unfortunately, sometimes those things don't get magnified. They don't get embraced by the public. It doesn't make the media, it doesn't get their attention because that's not important. That's not important. But when we can say that we have one of the lowest crime rates in the state of Maryland, and though crime has been increasing over the last few months, but I am very proud of the men and women of this department who do a variety of different jobs. And accountability has always been a very important aspect of our job and the criteria for this department. And there has been a process, not to say that it was a perfect process, but I will tell you that the managers of this department, myself as the chief of this department, take accountability very seriously and have done so. And under the auspices of our collective bargaining agreement, as we deal with labor laws and labor issues, it's all about, at the end of the day, when we look at what our officers who we hire are from the human race. And I want to make sure people clearly understand that, because there are some people who believe that police officers operate like they're RoboCops, like they're robots, in which they are not. They are human beings just like you are, all of you, their sons and daughters, their fathers and mothers, who have children who are being educated here in Montgomery County and in Maryland, who they care about, every day that they do their jobs. And it's very interesting to me how sometimes they get bastardized in many ways, and just simply about going out and doing their jobs. And they take a lot of heat from some individuals who simply don't like the police, and that's understandable. We are an authoritative agency that we enforce the laws that are embedded by and made by legislators, and then that's a reality. And that we have a functionality of protecting our community. And as it relates to the new bill, it is clear that there will be some significant changes to the process from which we now abide by. The Police Accountability Board will be that receiving end of external complaints by the community. We will be working hand in hand, and we are willing and able, and we're ready to go in order to be able to investigate those particular incidents as they are presented to my Internal Affairs Division. And then upon completion of our investigation, we will then provide the findings. We will provide the interviews, the body worn camera footage, if that is available for these types of, for any incident. We will provide all evidence to the Police Accountability Board for the Administrative Charging Committee to make a decision on whether or not an officer violated a policy in our department. Clearly, as everyone knows, this particular Police Accountability Board will have not only the oversight of my 1,250 officers to oversee, they'll also have to oversee, as Councilmember Albanos noted, the city of Gaithersburg, the city of Tacoma Park, the city of Rockville police departments, as well as the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department. So they have a large task ahead to be able to handle those amounts of complaints and to address, again, a fair system. And I think it's, as I saw in the presentation by Ms. Finkel, when we talk about procedural justice and legitimacy, I think it is a very important point that at the end of the day, anyone wants to be treated fair and just if you are being accused of a violation. administratively. So if you look at in each one of your jobs, your responsibility, you as an employee, being supervised by others, whoever those others may be, at the end of the day, you want a fair and just treatment in response to how discipline is actually warranted in any given case, no matter how minor or how major. And then at the end of the day, I believe it is very important as this is being developed, that it is a fair and just system that's developed. That is by prayer, because I believe in Montgomery County, those are the standards that we've set. Not to have individuals who are biased in their own way because they felt like they were mistreated in some way, that now they get an opportunity to get revenge on another officer who may not have even been involved in their particular situation. Those are the slippery slopes that we must be careful about when we actually are going to create this fair system. And so I believe that, again, that the police department has been ready to be able to deal and adjust to this new world of additional accountability. And there are things that we have, again, the laws that have been passed where disciplinary records are now that are now opened to the public. We have been providing those files to many individuals who have requested them recently as the law changed just this past October. So as we again transition, one thing I will say about where we are, yes, the rank and file of our department, those are those are our FOP members. Yes, they are part of this new law will not go into effect July 1st of 2023, but that does not that's not precluding my other officers who are unrepresented. They will be affected by this law July 1st, 2022, and the other law enforcement agencies that I noted, if they do not have a collective bargaining agreement, they will this will affect them starting July 1st of 2022. So I want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of that this will be needed to actually go into place for some of my officers here in Montgomery County because of the elimination of the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights and where we currently are in the legislation. So I will stop there for the sake of time, Cynthia, and turn it back over to you because I'm sure that there are questions that some folks have in the audience. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to turn the session over now to Amelia Brust for the Q&A portion.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you to all of our presenters. So once again, if you have a question you would like to submit for our Q&A, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the box and hit send or return. The questions will be visible as they are answered. And we're going to try to answer as many different people's questions as we have time for. And once again, we want to remind all of our attendees to be respectful of our presenters and one another as you pose your questions. And we are once again scheduled to end our webinar tonight at 8:30. So the first question I want to ask kind of gets to the heart of how this legislation would work, and that is how would the complaint process work, and how is it accessible to people who would want to make a complaint to the Police Accountability Board or the ACC?
Sure, I can try and start with that, and others can chime in. One of the amendments, I think Council President Albornoz mentioned this, that we took up at the council so far is that, and that the state has subsequently, I think, taken up as well, is that all complaints involving a member of the public will come to the PAB, and there's going to need to be a process by which that happens. Right now, well, I won't talk about right now. So there will be, you know, that's why it's so important for it to have a staff, for things to be advertised. And so that whether they're going directly to members or there's obviously going to be an email, I would imagine there'd be a number established. There's going to have to be processes that are established by the executive branch and by the staff of this body to make sure that it's accessible to the public. You know, it's a really important process. You know, if you don't know how to make a complaint and if you don't know who's eligible, that's a problem. So we've put in the intention of the law and the language of the law that it covers all complaints involving individuals, even wherever they originate from, and that it can come through multiple channels. And so the mechanics of that are going to have to be worked out, you know, outside of the legislation. But the intent is that there's an easy process and on-ramp for those to come in. And part of it, we're going to need to measure and see how much work is actually, how many are coming in and how many complaints are coming in and what's the workload look like and all those things. And that'll be as part of the executive's budget that they send over as far as staff, and they're working through that process. But the intent is that it's an easy process with multiple entry points.
Thank you very much. The next question I want to pose to the panel kind of relates to what was mentioned regarding the community input process at the beginning stages of working through this legislation. And as it's been mentioned, the original version of the bill has gone through a lot of amendments since then. So would you be able to talk a bit about how the council responded to the influx of community input since the beginning of this process, and also maybe even after this bill 4921 were to pass the council, what maybe community members in Montgomery County could do to still give their thoughts on it to the council or to the police department, et cetera?
Sure, I can try to set the stage for a little bit of just you may hear some background noise. So we got a rescue dog a couple of months ago. He's added a lot of joy to our family, but he's also added a lot of noise. So apologies in advance if there's some noise in the background. But so there was understandable frustration when the council introduced at the request of the county executive that there hadn't been input on the initial development of the bill before it got to the council. We've done several things to address that issue. None of them are perfect, but we've done our best given the circumstances and this tight timeline that we are on to make sure that we enact this as quickly as possible and as reasonably as possible. We added a second night or a second day, which was in the evening, for public testimony. So that is unusual for legislation to add more than one opportunity to be able to testify, but we knew the magnitude of this bill. And so that was a way that in an attempt to secure additional community feedback, and it was really effective because we had almost as many people testify the second day as we did the first day, which was very helpful. And during the committee work sessions, we did something that was actually unprecedented, at least on this council over these last 4 years, which was we invited 23 community stakeholders to participate in the committee work sessions through the Public Safety Committee, which included the chiefs of police of the respective municipalities, the labor organizations representing officers both at the sheriff level as well as Montgomery County Police, and community advocates, including the Silver Spring Justice Coalition, Casa de Maryland, and others to provide feedback in real time and engage in a dialogue. We knew, given the timing of this, that we were not going to be able to complete that process through our committee work session process. So we wanted to finalize this through the full council to make sure that we complied with the timeline set forth. And so the last 3 work sessions have been before the full council, but more than half of the policy decision-making had been done within the committee. We have also continued to receive feedback, sometimes in real time during our sessions when my colleagues receive text messages from community advocates who want to make a point or raise a question regarding a respective issue. And we invited in the Zoom room those same 23 advocates that were there as part of the committee work session process. And when we get to full council, any one of my colleagues has the opportunity to call upon somebody who was in the room to be able to answer a question. And they are still afforded that ability now, even though we have come back in person. But to date, we have focused our questions to the county attorney as well as the executive branch, who again will be charged with implementing this. But we've received feedback all the way through. And I think that many of the amendments that you have seen reflected have been driven by the community through their very wonderful due diligence and their recommendations. And so I think we've complied with maybe not all, many, and maybe even most of the recommendations that have been pushed forward by the advocates advocating for changes to our criminal justice system.
Thank you very much. The next question I have kind of combines a couple of these two, and it's mostly for Chief Jones, but anyone can chime in if they want to. Chief Jones, do you mind talking a bit about if there's any changes to the type of training that officers are going to have to undergo because of this new legislation? And if there are any aspects of that training that will deal with things like identifying racial bias in policing practices or in individuals' decision-making. Is there any development on that we can now expect from police officers in Montgomery County?
Okay, so as it relates to this particular law specifically, the answer is no from a standpoint of as it relates to this law. Now, as it relates to other training that has been developed, we have continuously dealt with various different types of training that has been upgraded and evolved as it relates to training such as de-escalation training that we continuously look at and annually have as a part of it. There are parts of the law that require certain things that police officers will now have to do as it relates to certain types of training that they may receive in regards to bias type training that the state has required in some provisions of the law that the Training Commission will oversee. So with that, we will, again, in many of those cases that they've made these provisions, we have already implemented that training in our police training curriculum over time, over the past few years. And we continuously review that annually. And as we do it annually, we look at providing revisions or additions to those trainings accordingly.
Great, thank you. There's a question here that asks if correctional officers at the county jail will be covered by any of this accountability legislation. I'd also like to just add to that if any of the city police departments are going to be subject to this new accountability legislation. And if not, why not?
The city departments, yes, they will be. Our municipal police departments are covered under this. But as the law is currently construed, it would not include corrections officers.
Okay, thank you. A question I'd like to pose to Florence. You mentioned something about how it's important, the tenure of people serving in these oversight bodies and also the individuals serving in government and law enforcement positions, that over time, if new people come in with new intentions or new goals, the original design of those oversight bodies may not stick. I kind of wanted to hear what you had to say about maybe advice to communities to keep the interest in these new oversight mechanisms going over time as new people come in and out of the system.
Yeah, you put it actually better than I did. I would say, I mean, in a lot of places, we're talking about trying to change the culture, or in new civilian oversight agencies actually building culture. And that's why tenure matters. It takes so long to establish, like for a civilian oversight organization, I was at the CCRB in 2 different positions for 11 years. I had it because I was there for so long. I had a chance to build the agency almost from the ground up. But a lot of, I think Chief Jones could testify about this, the tenure of police chiefs in a lot of organizations is very short-lived. And I think communities should do as much as they can if they have people in these positions that they want to try to keep them, because if they're doing a good job, you want them to continue to reform and build the processes for organizations. And, you know, constant turnover of police chiefs is if you have reformers in that office, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for the officers, the community, or the chiefs themselves. I'm not sure I totally answered your question, but.
That's okay. Thank you. The next question is, how will members of the boards be selected? Of the Police Accountability Board, I should say.
Good question. So I didn't mention, and I should have mentioned, that one of the other key recommendations was that we broaden the scope of the experiences of the people that we're looking for to serve on this board, so that it truly is representative of our entire community, including supporting people who may have a criminal background from being able to apply, because we want people with varied backgrounds and, again, life and professional experiences. We're expecting a high bar in terms of the commitment once people are on the advisory board, and we expect them to achieve it. But we want to make sure that it's representative of our entire community. So there will be a formal announcement when people can apply. The county executive's office will then sort through those applications. The county executive will then make recommendations to the county council, and then the county council will affirm whether or not we support those recommendations. Once that happens, then they will be able to move forward with the training and begin their work.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I just add, just very briefly, the legislation, the executive can appoint, and the council will confirm, just as far as the process.
Yep.
Of how the members will be appointed.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for about one more question, and I'm just going to ask, is the council at this point prepared in order to make the transparency part of this accountability legislation really work? That takes resources, and that takes mechanisms for data and things to be displayed for the public, to be searchable for the public, and also to be stored, like body camera footage. That all needs to be stored somewhere. Is the council at this point prepared to make those considerations, and as it looks over budgets and allocating resources to police and also to the PAB to be able to facilitate these data requests and public information requests that are likely to come out now?
Yeah, I'll tackle the first part of this. I know Councilmember Jawando is probably going to want to weigh in too, but I do, as was noted by Cynthia, serve on the Public Safety Committee as well. And the council in the last 2 budgets has enhanced the police department's budget in technology, specifically so that there can be the most up-to-date system in order for them to be able to store the reams of information that will be on file for a really long time. And we've also enhanced the Department of Police's budget in the area of having folks on board who can actually manage that process, and so that it's not given as an assignment in addition to somebody who's already got a lot going on. So we do absolutely stand ready to provide the sufficient resources, both on the back end to make sure that we've got the resources necessary for the administrative work that needs to be done. But as I mentioned, we also are going to place funds in to have full-time staff associated with this, as well as outside counsel. And they won't be working entirely by themselves. They'll have access to the other county services and data collection services that are available to them, because this is important to all of us.
Yep. And I would just agree with all of that. Would just add that also it's going to cost money to have independent counsel, but it's an important premise that we've put in the laws and amendment. And we're working with Dr. Stoddard, the assistant administrative officer, who will be managing this process on behalf of the county executive. And they are working on a budget. And we've been very clear to them that when we added the amendment, that there be full-time, appropriate, dedicated staff, as clear as we can be, that this would be the board would be funded appropriately. But also, to your point, if there's transparency and accountability, and there's a law saying that something has to be released to the public, for example, or to the board, if there's subpoena power, we have to make sure that, one, that there's resources there to comply, but also that it's happening. So yes, so I think there's a commitment from all of us to make sure that happens.
Great, thank you very much. I think we are about out of time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Cynthia.
Thank you all. Thank you so much to our esteemed presenters, and thank you to everyone watching tonight. If you enjoyed this free program and want to learn more about the League of Women Voters' work in Montgomery County, you can find out more about us, including how to support our efforts, at LWVMOCOMD.org. With that, we will say thank you again and good night.